So I'm always very interested in the theological statements that we make, claims that we assert in the liturgy, and then of course the claims that we assert when we're drinking coffee together. There's a gap between the two about the words in the Siddur and the words that we hold in our heart. And so I thought that today what we would do is to unpack that a little bit. There's so much that we bring to this moment around Yizkor, and I wanted to focus for a couple minutes on the Malei Rachamim prayer. It is a central prayer in this part of the service. It's the memorial prayer. It's recited during Yizkor. It's recited at a funeral. But let's slow down and look at it for a little bit. It's on page 336 in our Siddur. I also brought a slightly different translation at the top of the sheet. Of course, to bring us into it, right? This is the prayer that sounds something like different than when the Chazan says it, but when the rabbi does it, Malei Rachamim shochen b'maromim, right? To bring us into that space. Let's read it in the English, either on the sheet or in the Siddur, to see what are the assertions that we're making. So I'll read it from the sheet. God, who is full of mercy and dwells on high, provide a true rest on the wings of the divine presence among the holy and pure ones who shine as brightly as the brilliance of the sky to the soul of our beloved, who has gone to their eternity. The Garden of Eden will be their resting place. We beseech the merciful one to shade them forever with divine wings and to bind their soul up in the bonds of life. The Lord is their heritage, and they shall rest peacefully on her bed. And let us say, Amen. So what is the assertions that we're making, the theological statements that we're making with the Malei Rachamim prayer? And it can be the obvious. I'm not looking for deep insight at this point. Fran, did you say something? No. Okay. Oh, it was somewhere over there. Samantha? Okay. Right. Good that God is merciful, right? So that's the right off the bat, right? Malei Rachamim, that God is full of mercy, not just merciful, but Malei is full of mercy. Is that an obvious statement or a statement that can be challenged, or that you feel challenged when you're facing a moment like this? It's a hopeful statement, okay? So Morley's saying it's hopeful, it's aspirational, because certainly I have sat with many people in this moment around the time when you would, and they challenge the mercy of it, let alone God being full of mercy. This goes into the category of fairness, right? Is God fair? Is God merciful? That's a statement that is there. What's another? Yeah, Reuven. That God is far away? Okay. In what way is God far away? I'm sorry?
Dwells on high.
That God is someplace else. God is distant from us. And there's a sort of a hope that God will come closer to us, but that God is far away. And Todd?
There's an interventionist concept, right? That God is involved in individual outcomes for the departed.
Yeah, that God doesn't just operate on mass, on scale. God operates individually. Whereas God may be distant, God is also looking out for the individual as well, and maybe intervenes. You would suggest it. Great. So these are some of the opening statements that we're claiming. And Aryeh?
Suggest that we, whether God's merciful, whether God's going to apply the mercy or not, says God is full of mercy and is on high, and so it's an acknowledgement we need help to get through this. So we're asking the being God who has the mercy, who is on high, who can help, to help.
So Ari's making the point of kind of taking this to the next level, which is God is merciful, statement or a claim. God is distant, and that we also add to this idea that we hope that God brings that characteristic of God's self to us. Right? So just because God is merciful doesn't mean that God will show mercy on us. And so that's the prayerful, hopeful part as well. So the earliest reference to the El Malei Rachamim, and El Malei Rachamim is a bit newer than the other prayer, than the Yizkor prayer that's in here. But the earliest textual reference to it here is in the 1600s in a Kabbalist book, Ma'avar Yavok. And what's interesting to me is that where's that title come from? This is a book that is full of practices and rituals related to death, but it actually comes from the story in Genesis. I brought the pasuk here. This is when Jacob is concerned about engaging his brother again, re-encountering his brother. He sends all of his family and material possessions across the river, right, during the night, and then he's going to go encounter. Has nothing to do with this topic of death or anything. But I wonder that, and you could see in the Hebrew, right, that this is the phrase Ma'avar Yavok, that this is the phrase of where the title of the book comes from. And I wonder where the outside influences are of death crossing the river. Right? That is a very Greek Hellenist image. And yet somehow it influences, I think, it influences this deeply Jewish book, 17th century Jewish book. And so I thought that was an interesting idea. There aren't a lot of references that I found about Jewish spirits crossing the river. That's a metaphor from outside of our tradition that's been brought in. So the El Malei Rachamim. So here's just a little bit of history from El Bogan, a classic book on Jewish liturgy. After the Crusades, Ashkenaz and later also Rome introduced a prayer commemorating the martyrs of the community and others who had performed outstanding service for the collectivity. Av HaRachamim, Father of Mercy. From this, the custom developed later that individuals could also request prayers for family members who had died around the anniversary of their death. El Malei Rachamim, God full of mercy, and Hashkava, which is equivalent prayer in the Sephardic custom. So Morley, I want you to feel seen here. Yes. So, and then Reuven Hammer, who has written extensively about liturgy, he continues, and this is just the history of it, right? That prayers are recited at funerals and other times when commemorating the dead. The basic belief of Rabbinic Judaism concerning the afterlife is of the resurrection of the dead at some future time. Right? So there's a question, do we believe in the resurrection of the dead? What does that actually mean? I always, when I think about this, I think of, well, when one is resurrected, if one is resurrected, how are they resurrected? Are they resurrected as their, let's say, vibrant 20-year-old self, where they had the energy of youth and none of the wisdom of the ages, right? Or would you prefer to be resurrected in your maybe a little more aches and pains in your 50s or 60s when you really had wisdom of life, but maybe your body was not as vibrant? So the liturgy doesn't tell us how we are to be resurrected. I'm not even sure I have an answer as to what I would prefer, but that there is the distinction between our bodily resurrection and our soul. However, there also exists a concept of the soul, the life essence of the human being that survives the death of the body. The sages spoke of God keeping their souls at the heavenly throne until such time as they could be reunited with their resurrected bodies, and of reward and punishment for the soul. Thus, the righteous find their place in God Eden, the Garden of Eden mentioned in this prayer. So it's a holding pattern. It's a holding place for the soul, because the body, as we know, is physical and it deteriorates. But our soul is everlasting. And so where does our soul go? What happens to it? If anyone has had the honor of being someone at their deathbed when they have died, that there is a difference. And I don't know if that is the soul departing, but there is a different energy in the room that changes. And so maybe for the scientists, you want to claim it as the end of the electrical synapses or whatever firing, and that is a change. Maybe it is the soul departing. Whatever the explanation is, it's different. It is different, and it's an honor when I've had the opportunity to be with someone. Perhaps the most beautiful phrase the tradition uses, and the one that can most easily be accepted today, is "Shelter them, merciful one, besete kanfecha." It's a typo. Yes, I was like, that doesn't sound right. In the shelter of your wings. And as Kohelet writes, the dust returns to the ground as it was, and the life breath returns to God who gave it, right? All typos are mine. All good ideas are the author's. That we have this idea that the soul and the body are separate from each other. And it is hard to distinguish because we live our life through our bodies and all of our senses. And the soul is independent of our senses. So the whole conversation about what happens to the soul has to be purely metaphoric and not what actually happens, because the soul doesn't have touch or smell or sight or any of our five senses. The soul is independent of our bodies, and so that we know that it has to operate differently. Now, some, if we go to the back, have the belief that if this is from the Mishnah Brura, if we go to a cemetery, that the dead can act on our behalf to God. Now, within the tradition, there's a fine line here, right? Because does that person act on our behalf? It skirts the line or gets close to the line of avodah zarah, right? So we are focused on God, not on the person, right? The cemetery is the resting place of tzaddikim, and prayers are better accepted there. But don't aim your intention towards the dead, but rather request of the Holy One, may he be blessed, to have mercy on you in the merit of the tzaddikim in the earth there. And encircle the cemetery and give tzedakah before you make your pleas. And do not go to the grave twice in a single day. Right? Don't think that you are praying to that person. You're really praying to God. And it's important to have that distinction. And of course, do an action, make an action, give tzedakah, do something to add to the betterment of the world. And these are all claims that we bring about, whether it's explicit or implicit, when we're spending time thinking about the dead. That we want them, and even in the prayers that we'll offer in just a moment, we want them to intercede for us. But we also want to be inspired by them. Not everyone believes in the words of the Malei Rachamim or the theological statements they assert. Right? So here, this book by Milgram is really just a reference book. But he inserts his opinion about, I think, the modern synagogue in a really terrific way. And so, Chazan, don't be offended by this. But I think he takes a cheap shot at clergy as a whole here. So the Yizkor formula is followed by the reader's haunting chant of the prayer, El Malei Rachamim, God full of mercy. In content, this prayer adds nothing new, for it generally repeats what was already said in the Yizkor prayer. I told you the earlier prayer, the Yizkor prayer. But the traditional chant stirs the hearts and evokes tender memories of the dead. Unfortunately, the Yizkor service has lost much of its spiritual power. Not only has it shared the fate of all prayers in our days, but also it has been vulgarized by many well-meaning people who have embellished it and exaggerated eulogies of the dearly beloved who have been called to their eternal rest. Right? He's taking cracks at rabbis and chazanim, I think. These flowery but artificial additions have vitiated the simplicity and the dignity of the Yizkor service. Right? So I love this because he's really, I mean, this is a modern book. This isn't an old book, but he really decides to insert himself into his opinions. You know, what do you really think? Right? But also there's another example of pushing back against the El Malei Rachamim, and I think that it's important that we sit with this. The power of El Malei is both in the cadence of having a moment, and also that's when we think of people, that there's a power in it of just saying it, and it doesn't matter what the words mean, because we are together, we have trained ourselves. It is a ritual of memory, and that's very powerful. But also, is God really full of mercy? Right? To think of that person and the circumstances of their death, was that merciful? Maybe. And we've encountered friends and others where it was not. Was it fair? We've encountered enough in our lives to see that fair is not part of the equation. So Yehuda Amachai offers this poem. He says, and he titles it El Malei Rachamim, God full of mercy, the prayer for the dead. If God was not full of mercy, mercy would have been in the world, not just in him. I who pluck flowers in the hills and look down into all the valleys, I who brought corpses down from the hills, can tell you that the world is empty of mercy. I who was king of salt at the seashore, who stood without a decision at my window, who counted the steps of angels, whose heart lifted weights of anguish in the horrible contests. I who use only a small part of the words in the dictionary. I who must decipher riddles I don't want to decipher. Know that if not for the God full of mercy, there would be mercy in the world, not just in him. Right? And at the note underneath, there's a YouTube of Amichai talking about this poem. So I offer that for you. Right? That here he's saying that God may be full of mercy and far away, but God, if he is being the decisor of when and where mercy gets distributed, that is unfair. That if the world was full of mercy and not just God, that we would all be able to benefit from it. So I think El Malei Rachamim is both simultaneously a prayer of comfort. It is a prayer of memory. It is a prayer of inspiring us to do something more. And also it's a prayer of challenge to see what is the world that we are going to create. Because God might be far away, but we are right here within our community to hold each other up and to make this world a better place, filled with mercy, filled with compassion, and filled with tzedek.